G'day. Firstly, I too would like to acknowledge that we're standing on Aboriginal land and pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the AOMA Nation, the traditional owners of this land, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm very pleased to speak at this first conference of ocular melanoma down under. For those of you who've seen my t-shirt, this is not the first patient experience type ocular melanoma I've been to. Being a GP, I actually have the advantage and resources and tax deductibility to go to this conference in the US, and I've been there a few times. A lot of this is about personal experiences and identity. Most of you I'm presuming most of the, if not all of the patients and carers here have been involved to some extent on the Facebook page and the group, and thank you very much, Susan, for the work you've done in setting that up. I'm a rural doctor. I can't take that away from myself. I practice in Tamworth. I'm very involved in medical politics and the training of GPs. I'm also involved strategically about running health services. I'm on a local health district board that looks after the health of a million people in New South Wales. I come from a time and an era in medical training whereby the whole of yourself is very much involved with being a doctor. I can't separate myself from that identity, and I suppose the addition I've got to Glenn's talk is don't forget your GP as a resource. Although you might say, oh look, this is a rare condition and a doctor's not going to know anything about it, you'd be surprised how quickly we can look up things in Google. From my perspective as a practicing GP, rare conditions are very common. When you look at the totality of them, I've got quite a number of patients who actually have very rare conditions, and most doctors do. Transition to life as a patient has been hard. There is such a thing as actually having a bit too much information. And many doctors have written on that journey that they've made. So I suppose I better tell you about mine. I have to go back to, it was the summer of 2012 and 13, and it was probably the worst time of my life because was going through, and I've got a reasonable sized general practice of which at that time I had a business partner and we were going through I suppose a divorce, or similar to a divorce in that we were very much in dispute with each other. A whole lot of stress, and why do I mention that? It'll become very relevant very soon. It was January, and for those of you that don't know, January in Tamworth is country music month. The streets are packed. It was 45 degrees. The buskers were going, and I'm walking along, and I look at this clock and think, my God, that clock looks really funny. It was all distorted, and I can still remember it very much to this day. And I don't know if people are aware of what an Amsler grid is. It's that little cross-haired grid pattern thing that you test your own vision with if you're prone to a condition called macular degeneration. So I pulled out one of those and saw that the things that you weren't supposed to see, and promptly diagnosed myself as having macular degeneration. My God, I'm only in my 50s, what am I going to do? The advantage of being a doctor in town is I could ring up and sweet talk the receptionist at the ophthalmologist and say, look, I've got a bit of a problem here, and got in to see them. And I mean, all of you have been to ophthalmologists. They've all got these fancy machines. You have a test at every one of them, and after about an hour, the ophthalmologist opposite you finally sits down, and you've met him a couple of times socially before, and says, he says to me, "Do you have any stress in your life at the moment?" I said, "Well, yeah, it's a whole lot of this stuff going on." And he promptly told me I've got this condition called central serous retinopathy. Now, that's I mean, I'd never heard of the condition before, but when I Googled it and when he talked about it, it was first discovered during the Korean War, when suddenly a whole lot of their sharpshooters developed eye problems and could not see clearly enough to be sharpshooting. And there was a whole lot of thinking that these soldiers were just malingering. It was just, their attempt to get away from the front lines. But in actual fact, it's a real condition brought on by stress, where edema comes over the central part of the vision. There's a fluid level there. And it's thought to be due to stress. And he said, "Look, don't worry, it'll go in 3 months." And, I turned up for my reviews every month, and 6 months later, I get he says, "Oh, look, I think we better get a retinal specialist." And look, there's one coming up in a couple of weeks' time to Tamworth, and you can see him. And, I go and see him, and he as doctors do, makes all these, "Look, I want you to go and see a colleague of mine." Now, Glenn, actually, you raised this yourself about the delays and the time it takes to get diagnosed. Look, ocular melanoma is a rare condition, we all know that. Incidence is about 8 per million, and that means there are 200 new cases in Australia every year. From a incidence as far as doctors go, it means I, as a practicing GP, I will have one patient with it during the whole of my practicing career. A general ophthalmologist will see one every few years. A retinal specialist will see 3 or 4 in a year. And of course, our ocular melanoma, our ocular oncologists will see probably a new one every week or so. What we do know is that melanoma outcomes are better the earlier that treatment commences, but delay in diagnosis and treatment are common. I actually looked at the research, and one study showed that 37% of patients with a new ocular melanoma had their eyes examined in the previous year without detecting the melanoma, and 71% of that 37% had their eyes dilated. So one thing that's happening is that current screening isn't actually working that well. How do we improve the detection rate of ocular melanoma? It's Ocular Melanoma Month, it's May. We're all advised to get an annual dilated eye exam, but my story with melanoma isn't that atypical. So, I got the message from the retinal oncologist. I had to go and see this fellow called Michael Giblin. So I'm in Sydney, I get a phone call, and I get a, "Hi, it's Michael Giblin here. You remember the phone call? Well, Michael, I've got your pictures and I wanted to let you know that you've got a melanoma." Okay, so we chatted a while, and going to see you tomorrow, whatever. And suddenly my mind wanders back to medical school. Now, in medical school, we don't get told much about ocular melanoma. But I do remember that one of the things we learnt is, what was the diagnosis? Someone who's got a glass eye and you're feeling their liver and it's all lumpy. Yep, that's ocular melanoma. So I'm thinking, okay, this is not a particularly good thing to have. And I go back to what I'm doing, and what I was doing at that time, I was actually selecting entrance to general practice training. It's a whole day of one-on-one interviews. Don't get me wrong, Michael, I love you very much. We're both health professionals as well. But look, each patient with cancer only gets one opportunity to hear the news they've got cancer. Thankfully, I had a whole lot of support around me at the time, and I had some really good friends around, so that was quite helpful. And look, I saw Michael next day. We talked about treatments and the fact. Look, my melanoma is small, flat, central, thin, and we weren't even. It was able to be monitored at that sort of stage. We've talked about plaques. At that stage, there was no ruthenium plaques available in New South Wales. Quite bizarre, we spent a fortune on medicine, but a ruthenium plaque is $20,000 for a year, 18 months worth of treatment. I went off and chatted to my local MP. I got a very nice letter from the Minister for Health, who I knew personally, and was told that iodine is good enough. Trouble with iodine, of course, is it's a heavier radioactivity, you lose more vision. So I went down and saw John McKenzie down in Victoria at the Eye and Ear. I've had my plaque and treatment seemed so good, and 6-month follow-ups, and I don't have a particular problem. So I suppose my identity's changed. I'm now the GP with cancer. It's a rare cancer, but I suppose I'm in a rare subgroup there. I've always been very active in social media, and I suppose I take an interest in. I'm a GP. I can't take that away from myself, and I think I've got a very caring nature. So I tend to keep a bit of a surveillance on fellow patients around the world. I don't tend to provide advice directly, but those of you see me out there, I try and provide fairly general responses. The good thing is I've had the opportunity to meet a whole lot of people in person. As I say, I've been to the US many times, and I've had the opportunity to learn a whole lot about OM treatment and the options, and some of the patients I remember. And I still remember my very first meeting. It was in Cleveland. Someone came up and tapped me on the shoulder and said in an American accent that we do need to talk. And the bizarre thing is, Kamerman is not the most common name in the world. And blow me down, there was another guy there with the same name. So we had the same name, the same rare cancer, and to top it off, he was a doctor as well, which I thought was really quite bizarre. And we've seen each other every year at the conferences I go to. I've been and visited him socially. Dave's a really nice guy, did a whole lot of fundraising for the Ocular Melanoma Foundation. Personally, I think they funded not one but 2 research scholars for the foundation. Unfortunately, David passed away from his tumour late last year, so it was a very sad time in the OM community in the States. The problem with the information that we receive is that a whole lot of our social media content comes from America. People over there, the treatment choices are very much, slightly different. People are obviously on social media, they're talking about their personal experiences. They're very passionate about the treatment choices they've made, and that's because they're heavily invested in it. And America, of course, does provide the best treatment that money can actually afford. To my eye, I didn't realise I'd written that pun, there's significant overservicing in areas of treatment which really are of no proven benefit. And everyone's really desperate because you don't want to be in the 50% that gets metastases. You all want to be on the 50% that doesn't get them. And the theory is if you get metastases, you want to find out about them as quick as possible. These are not groups that you can have a long discussion with around, or a sensible discussion on things like lead time bias. One of the issues that finding metastases early is you also live longer with them because you know about them earlier. So there's a whole lot of research that needs to be done about the effectiveness of a whole of these treatments. But I agree that treatment for metastases do seem to be improving. People are living longer, quite seriously longer these days, which means that surveillance for our condition has gone from, 5 years ago I had certainly the point of view that, and this is part of having medical knowledge, that you don't do screening for things where you can't actually make a difference. But the thing is, I think now that metastases treatment is so changing and is now offers a significant improvement in quality of life and length of life, that certainly makes surveillance worthwhile. And I think one of my last bit of advice today is going to be that, look, we're only a small country. We've got only 1 or 2 or 3 ocular oncologists in each state. We've got even fewer medical oncologists that specialise in ocular melanoma. We really do need a clear and concise national guideline as far as what's appropriate for screening for metastases in Australia in 2019. So, thank you.